I didn't plan to confront her that night. I just wanted answers. The house was quiet in the way it gets after a funeral, when everyone has left, but the weight of their presence still hangs in the air. I stood in my grandmother's old sitting room with the USB clutched in my hand, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure my sister could hear it from the hallway. I plugged it into my laptop and pressed play before I could lose my nerve. My grandmother's face filled the screen. Calm, steady, prepared. She said my name, Beatrice, and the sound of it nearly brought me to my knees. She told me, clearly and without hesitation, that I had never been the problem, that for years lies had been told in my name, that someone in this family had worked carefully, patiently, to make sure I was pushed out while believing I deserved it. I didn't notice my sister step into the room until the floor creaked behind me. At first, she laughed. A short, sharp sound. She asked what I was watching, told me to turn it off. When I didn't move, her laughter died. Her face changed in stages I would later replay in my mind over and over. Confusion, calculation, panic. Then she lunged. Her fingers twisted into my hair so hard my scalp burned. I screamed once before she yanked me backward, dragging me across the hardwood floor. My knees slammed down, the breath knocked out of me in a white flash of pain. I clawed at her wrist, but she was stronger than I expected, stronger than she had ever needed to be before. She leaned down so close I could smell her perfume, the expensive kind she always wore when she wanted to be taken seriously. Her voice was low, controlled, almost gentle. "You deserve nothing," she hissed. "You never did." She shoved me away, and I hit the wall hard, my vision blurring. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't even tell if I was breathing. She straightened her clothes, smoothed her hair, and walked out of the room as if she hadn't just left me crumpled on the floor, unable to lift my head. The last thing I remember before everything dimmed was the sound of footsteps somewhere else in the house. I came back to myself slowly, the pain arriving in waves. My cheek was pressed against the floor, cool and unforgiving. My sister was gone. The laptop lay on its side a few feet away, the screen dark now, as if the truth my grandmother had left me had been swallowed by the room. I lay there, staring at the wall, thinking this was it. This was how it ended, not with anyone believing me, not with justice, just silence. She thought she had finished the job. I didn't know then that she was wrong. My name is Beatrice Holloway. I was 31 years old that night, and I worked as the head of administrative human resources at a mid-sized company in the Midwest. On paper, I was competent, trusted, respected. In my family, I was something else entirely, a glorified typist, a placeholder daughter, someone useful when paperwork needed doing and invisible the rest of the time. I had learned early that staying quiet made life easier, that not asking for recognition kept the peace. I had learned to shrink myself until I fit into whatever space they left for me. That habit had followed me into adulthood, into every family interaction where my sister sat at the center and I hovered at the edges. That night, lying on my grandmother's floor, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't just about inheritance or old grudges. This was about control, about erasing someone slowly enough that no one noticed it happening. My sister hadn't attacked me because I accused her. She attacked me because the truth threatened to take something from her she had guarded for years. I tried to move my fingers. They trembled, but they obeyed. Pain shot through my shoulder when I shifted, sharp enough to make me gasp, but I welcomed it. Pain meant I was still here. I listened. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. She must have thought I couldn't get up. Must have thought fear would finish what her hands had started. I wondered, dimly, how many times she had walked away from situations like this believing she had won, simply because no one spoke up. I thought of my grandmother's face on the screen, of the way she had looked straight into the camera, as if she knew exactly what would happen if I ever found that USB. She had warned me, gently, that the truth could make people dangerous. At the time, I hadn't understood what she meant. Now I did. I reached for my phone, then realized it wasn't in my pocket. Panic fluttered in my chest before I forced it down. I was done panicking. Panic had never protected me before. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. Another sound followed, quieter still. Not my sister. Something else. I lay there, heart racing, unsure if it was real or something my shock-fogged mind had invented. My vision swam, dark at the edges, but one thought stayed clear. She believed she had erased me. She had no idea what had just been seen. The words she had spat at me didn't fade when she left the room. They stayed, looping in my head long after the pain settled into a dull throb. You deserve nothing. The sentence didn't feel new. It felt familiar, like something I had been taught to believe long before that night. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind slid backward to the beginning, to the version of myself who didn't yet know how small she was expected to be. Growing up, my sister was the story my parents loved to tell. She was bold, confident, always the first to speak and the last to be forgotten. Teachers praised her. Neighbors admired her. My parents repeated her accomplishments like they were proof of something they had done right. When she walked into a room, attention followed her naturally, like gravity. When I walked in, there was a pause, a glance, sometimes a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. I was the quiet one, the helpful one, the child who knew how to stay out of the way. I learned early that approval came easier when I didn't ask for it. At family dinners, my sister talked and everyone listened. I passed plates, refilled glasses, cleared dishes. When relatives asked what I was up to, my answers were summarized by my parents before I finished speaking. She's doing fine. She helps out at work. Nothing much to report. It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said with certainty, as if my life simply didn't require elaboration. I carried that certainty with me into adulthood. When I landed my first real job after college, I called my parents from my car, hands shaking with excitement. I told them about the offer, the benefits, the responsibility. There was a brief silence on the line before my mother responded. "That's nice, Bea." And then, without missing a beat, she launched into a story about my sister's latest success. A promotion, a new opportunity, something bigger, better, louder. No one asked how I felt. No one asked what it meant to me. When I hung up, the excitement drained out of me, replaced by a quiet shame I couldn't explain. That pattern repeated itself year after year. Birthdays passed with quick texts instead of calls. Holidays were planned without my knowledge. I learned about family gatherings through photos posted online, everyone smiling around a table I hadn't known existed. When I asked why I hadn't been invited, the answers were always vague. "We thought you were busy. It was last minute. You didn't miss much." Eventually, I stopped asking. I told myself it was easier this way. Less conflict, less disappointment. I convinced myself that distance was a choice I had made, not something that had been decided for me. It was a comforting lie, one that allowed me to believe I still had control. But small moments kept breaking through that illusion. I remember overhearing my sister on the phone once, her voice low and serious. She was talking about me. She didn't use my name. She said things like difficult and sensitive and holding grudges. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as she painted a version of me I didn't recognize. When she noticed me, she smiled like nothing had happened. I didn't confront her. I didn't defend myself. I went back to my room and wondered how long that story had been circulating without me. After that, my parents' tone changed. They became cautious around me, as if I might explode at any moment. Conversations were measured. Compliments disappeared. Any disagreement was framed as proof that my sister had been right all along. I started apologizing for things I hadn't done, for being quiet, for being tired, for not visiting enough, even when no one had invited me. Somewhere along the way, I accepted the role they had assigned me, the difficult one, the distant one, the disappointment they never named out loud. The only person who never treated me that way was my grandmother. She didn't praise me loudly or defend me publicly. She didn't confront my parents or argue with my sister. Instead, she noticed things. She remembered details about my work, asked about my days, told me she was proud of me in quiet moments when no one else was listening. When I visited, she made space for me at the table, literally pulling out a chair and patting it until I sat down. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed she was just kind. I didn't understand that kindness in a family like mine was a form of resistance. Looking back, I see the pattern clearly now. The way my sister controlled the narrative. The way my parents accepted it without question. The way I was slowly edited out of my own family while being told it was my fault. Lying on that floor after the attack, the realization hit me with more force than the blow to my head. This hadn't happened by accident. The isolation, the coldness, the subtle shift from neglect to suspicion. It had all served a purpose. Someone had benefited from me being alone, from me doubting myself, from me staying silent. And when the truth finally threatened to surface, that same person had chosen violence over exposure. The night my sister dragged me across the floor wasn't the beginning of her cruelty. It was the moment the mask slipped far enough for me to see what had been underneath all along. As the house remained quiet around me, I understood something that changed everything. She hadn't erased me because I was weak. She had erased me because she was afraid of what would happen if I was ever truly seen. The house felt different once the funeral was over. Not empty exactly, but unsettled, as if the walls were holding their breath. I moved through my grandmother's rooms slowly, every step careful, my body still sore from the night before. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, softening the edges of furniture she had chosen decades ago. This was the house where she had lived quietly, watched carefully, and kept her thoughts mostly to herself. Standing there alone, I felt like I was trespassing on something unfinished. I told myself I was just here to help sort things, to be useful the way I had always been expected to be. But my hands kept drifting toward the small details. The stack of notebooks by her chair, the drawer she always kept locked, the cabinet in her study where she stored old photographs and papers she never threw away. That was where I found it. The container was nothing special. A small tin box tucked behind a row of outdated manuals, the kind of thing anyone could overlook. Inside was a single USB drive. No decoration, no explanation. Just my name written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, slightly unsteady but unmistakable. For a long moment, I stared at it without touching it. My first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was fear. A deep, tightening fear that whatever was on that drive would confirm everything my sister had spent years implying, that I really was difficult, ungrateful, a disappointment who had driven her own family away. I told myself I could put it back, close the box, pretend I never saw it. I almost did. I sat at my grandmother's desk with the USB in my palm, weighing it like it could tell me what it held if I waited long enough. My chest felt tight, my thoughts looping through every possible outcome. If this was proof against me, at least it would explain things. At least the confusion would end. My hand shook as I plugged it into the laptop. The screen flickered, and then my grandmother appeared. She was sitting in the armchair by the window, the one where she used to read in the afternoons. Her hair was neatly brushed. Her posture was straight, deliberate. She looked directly into the camera, as if she knew exactly who would be watching. "Beatrice," she said, my name steady on her tongue. "If you're seeing this, then something has happened that I hoped never would." My breath caught. Tears blurred the screen, but I didn't wipe them away. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She didn't circle the truth. She told me plainly that I had never been the problem, that for years she had watched lies take shape around me, repeated often enough that they hardened into facts in other people's minds. She said she recognized the pattern early on, but chose silence out of fear that confronting it would tear the family apart. "I was wrong," she said quietly, "and I am sorry." Her apology landed harder than any accusation ever had. She spoke about my sister carefully, not with anger, but with precision. She described moments I had lived through without understanding them, conversations overheard, expressions that didn't match the words being spoken, the satisfaction my sister seemed to take in describing my supposed distance, my imagined bitterness. "She doesn't need you to disappear," my grandmother said. "She needs you to believe you deserve it." I felt something shift inside me then, something I hadn't realized was still flexible. My grandmother admitted she had kept records, notes written after phone calls, dates she never forgot, things she didn't share because she didn't know who would believe her. She explained why she had hidden the USB instead of giving it to me directly, why she had waited. "I needed you to be ready," she said, "and I needed her to show herself." The video continued, my grandmother's voice calm even as the content grew heavier. She warned me not to confront my sister impulsively. She said the truth, once threatened, could make people reckless, dangerous. She looked tired when she said it, as if the weight of that knowledge had followed her for years. "You are not weak for surviving quietly," she told me. "You are not wrong for wanting peace, but you must protect yourself now." By the time the screen went dark, I was shaking. Grief hit first, sharp and sudden. Grief for the years she had watched me struggle alone, for the protection she hadn't been able to give me while she was alive. Then came anger, hot and steady, not at her, but at the truth I had been denied for so long. I replayed the video once, then again. Each time, the words settled deeper. The narrative I had carried my entire life began to crack. Memories rearranged themselves. Conversations made sense in ways they never had before. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't been too sensitive. I had been isolated deliberately. A sound pulled me out of my thoughts. Footsteps. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The laptop screen reflected my face, pale and tight with fear. Slowly, carefully, I closed it and pulled the USB free, wrapping it in my hand like a lifeline. The house wasn't empty anymore. I could hear movement down the hall, someone shifting, someone close enough to hear if I made a sound. My grandmother's warning echoed in my head, sudden and urgent. "Once the truth is known, you are no longer safe." I stood there in the quiet, the weight of the USB heavy in my pocket, understanding for the first time that knowledge wasn't just power, it was a threat, and the person it threatened most was already inside the house. I closed the laptop and slid the USB into my pocket, my pulse loud enough to drown out the quiet of the house. The video was still playing in my head, my grandmother's voice steady and certain, and I clung to it like a railing in the dark. I told myself I would stay calm. I would ask questions. I would not accuse. I would not give her anything she could twist. I stepped into the hallway and found my sister by the kitchen counter, pouring herself a glass of water. She looked up as if nothing in the world had changed. Her face was composed, her movements precise, the same version of her I had grown up with, the one everyone trusted. "You look awful," she said lightly. Funeral days do that to people. I found something, I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. She tilted her head. Found what? I was in Grandma's study. That was enough. I watched it happen in real time, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes sharpened as if measuring distance. She didn't ask what I'd found. She didn't have to. There's nothing in there that concerns you, she said. You always did have a habit of snooping. I kept my hands open at my sides. She left me something. Her mouth tightened. Did she? Yes. Silence stretched between us, thick and humming. She took a slow sip of water, watching me over the rim of the glass. When she set it down, her voice was still calm, but something brittle crept into it. You're imagining things again, she said. After everything, I really hoped you wouldn't do this. Do what? 'Cause trouble. She sighed, the sound heavy with practiced disappointment. The family doesn't need it. Mom and Dad don't need it. The old reflex flared, the urge to apologize, to soften, to step back into the place that kept things smooth. I felt it and resisted for the first time in my life. She recorded it, I said. Her eyes flicked to my pocket. Recorded what? Everything. The word hung there. Everything. I saw the moment she realized how much control she was about to lose. The calculation in her gaze turned sharp, then angry. You have no right, she snapped. She was sick. You took advantage of her. No, I said. You did. Her laugh was short and humorless. You really believe that, don't you? I don't believe it, I said. I know it. She stepped closer, invading my space, the way she always had when she wanted to intimidate without witnesses. You think playing detective makes you important? She asked quietly. You think this changes who you are? I stood my ground. It changes what you've done. That was when her hand shot out. She grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked hard, pain exploding across my scalp. I cried out as she dragged me backward, my feet slipping on the tile. My shoulder slammed into the doorframe, my vision flashing white. I tried to twist free, my hands scrabbling at her wrist, but she was relentless, pulling me across the floor toward the hallway. Stop! I gasped, the word tearing out of me uselessly. She leaned down, her face inches from mine, eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen so clearly before. You don't get to rewrite my life, she hissed. You don't get to take what I've earned. I felt the wall behind me before I saw it. She shoved me hard, my head striking with a crack that echoed through the house. The impact stole my breath. The world tilted. I slid down, my legs folding beneath me as my vision blurred at the edges. She crouched in front of me, her grip still tight in my hair. Her voice dropped, controlled and precise. You deserve nothing, she said. You never did. You were supposed to stay quiet. Then she let go. I collapsed fully to the floor, my body refusing to respond when I tried to move. She stood, straightened her clothes, smoothed her hair as if preparing to greet company. For a moment, she looked down at me with something like satisfaction. Don't make this worse for yourself, she said. She turned and walked away, her footsteps steady, unhurried. The sound of them faded down the hall and up the stairs. A door closed softly. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my head pounding in time with my heart. I tried to lift my arm. Nothing happened. Panic fluttered in my chest, sharp and fast, but I forced myself to breathe through it. In and out. In and out. She thought she had finished it. She thought fear would keep me exactly where she wanted me. The house settled around me, the old creaks and sighs returning as if nothing had occurred. For a moment, I wondered if I would pass out. If I would wake up hours later, alone, with the truth locked away, and no proof I had ever stood up at all. Then I heard something else. Not her footsteps. Not the stairs. Another sound. Closer. A quick intake of breath. Fabric shifting. Someone moving in a way that didn't belong to the house. My vision swam, dark creeping in at the edges, but the thought cut through it clean and sharp. She believed she had silenced me. She had no idea she wasn't the only one who had seen what she did. I came back to myself slowly, the pain anchoring me before the fear could. My head throbbed where it had struck the wall, each pulse a reminder that I was still here. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that pretends nothing happened. She had walked away believing she'd finished the job. I tried to push myself up and failed. My arm shook, useless, and a sharp breath tore out of me before I could stop it. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths the way I'd learned to do in stressful meetings at work. In, out, in, out. Panic didn't help. Panic never helped. A shadow crossed the doorway. "B," he said softly. I turned my head as much as I could. My fiancé stood there, pale, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of fury and restraint. He knelt beside me immediately, careful with his hands, asking questions in a low, steady voice. Could I move my fingers? Did I feel dizzy? Where did it hurt? "She thinks you're gone," he said, and there was something cold and controlled in the way he said it. "She thinks you're scared enough to stay quiet." He helped me sit up, bracing my back against the wall. The movement sent sparks of pain through my shoulder, but I welcomed it. Pain meant I could still feel. I could still fight. "I heard everything," he said. "From the hallway." I swallowed. "Then you know." He nodded once. "I know." He hesitated, just for a moment, and I saw him make a decision. He reached into his pocket and held out his phone. "There's something else," he said. I looked at the screen. My sister's voice filled the small space between us, unmistakable and cruel. The angle was imperfect, the image slightly shaky, but it captured everything that mattered. Her hand in my hair. My body dragged across the floor. Her face as she leaned down and told me I deserved nothing. Watching it from the outside did something strange to me. The shame I'd expected never came. Instead, clarity settled in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family argument. This was an assault. I handed the phone back, my fingers steadier than I felt. "She can't talk her way out of that," I said. "No," he replied. "She can't." He asked if I wanted to call the police right then. The word hung between us, heavy and serious. I thought about it, about the consequences, about what it would mean to finally name what she had done. The fear flickered, brief and familiar, and then it passed. "Not yet," I said. "She's planning something. I can feel it." He didn't argue. He trusted me, and that trust mattered more than anything else in that moment. He told me he had already reached out to the attorney handling my grandmother's estate. Quietly, carefully. The lawyer hadn't been surprised. There had been questions, he said. Irregularities, documents that didn't quite line up. The USB my grandmother left me fit into a pattern that was already forming. The pieces were moving, even when I wasn't. My phone buzzed an hour later. A message from my mother. Short, controlled, repeating my sister's words almost verbatim. "She's worried about you. You've been acting strangely. We just want to protect the family." I stared at the screen and felt something inside me settle for good. The pattern was complete now. She wasn't just reacting. She was building a story, one where I was unstable, and she was the reasonable one forced to step in. I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I let silence do the work. We cleaned the small cut on my head, iced my shoulder, packed what little I needed from the house. Every movement felt deliberate, as if I were stepping out of a role I'd played for years and into something unfamiliar. Control didn't come from shouting or proving or pleading. It came from choosing when to speak. That night, lying awake beside him, I thought about how easily she had walked away from me, how calm she had been. She hadn't looked back because she didn't think she needed to. In her mind, fear had always been enough to keep me in place. She had no idea what was being preserved, what was being verified, what was waiting. The date for the estate meeting was confirmed the next morning. I could picture her already, rehearsing her concern, organizing her folders, perfecting the version of events she planned to sell. She would walk into that room believing she owned it, believing I would crumble the way I always had. I didn't feel excitement when I imagined it. I didn't feel revenge. I felt something quieter and stronger. Readiness. She had dragged me across the floor and walked away thinking she'd erased me again. She never saw what was being saved in plain sight. The morning of the estate meeting arrived too quickly and not quickly enough at the same time. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my jacket, studying the faint bruise near my hairline. I had covered it carefully, but I knew it was still there, a quiet reminder of how close I had come to disappearing without anyone noticing. My fiancé stood behind me, resting his hands lightly on my shoulders. "Remember," he said, his voice low and steady. "We wait." I nodded. Waiting was something I understood. The lawyer's office was cool and impersonal, all glass and muted colors, designed to make emotions feel out of place. Chairs were arranged around a long table, papers stacked neatly at one end. It smelled faintly of coffee and toner. Neutral. Safe. The opposite of my grandmother's house. My parents arrived first. They sat together, close but stiff, their eyes avoiding mine. I caught my mother looking at me once, her expression tight with something I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe. Or suspicion. I looked away before it could turn into something else. Then my sister walked in. She looked flawless, hair perfectly styled, makeup soft and understated, grief worn like a carefully chosen accessory. She greeted the lawyer warmly, squeezed my mother's hand, murmured something reassuring into my father's ear. When she finally glanced in my direction, her expression was calm, almost kind, as if we were strangers meeting under unfortunate circumstances. I felt the old instinct stir, the urge to shrink, to brace myself. I pressed it down. The lawyer began with formalities, his voice even and practiced. My sister leaned forward slightly, hands folded, the picture of patience. When he invited her to speak, she didn't hesitate. She talked about family, about unity, about how hard the past few weeks had been on everyone. She said my grandmother had been vulnerable near the end, easily influenced, and that she worried some decisions had been made under emotional strain. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing words that would sound reasonable no matter how they landed. Then she turned to me. "I'm concerned about Beatrice," she said gently. "She's been under a lot of stress. She's always struggled with feeling overlooked, and I think that grief has made that worse." My mother nodded faintly. My sister opened a folder and slid papers across the table. Printed messages, notes, a timeline she had clearly spent hours preparing. She claimed I had been demanding, erratic, manipulative, that I had pressured our grandmother, created tension, caused unnecessary conflict. Each word felt like a familiar weight settling back onto my chest. I opened my mouth once, then closed it. My hands trembled in my lap. Every instinct screamed to defend myself, to correct the record, to explain. I forced myself to breathe and remembered my grandmother's voice. Stay still. Let them show themselves. My parents' questions weren't harsh, but they weren't kind either. They asked why I hadn't said something sooner, why I hadn't come to them if I felt wronged. The implication hung heavy in the room. If this were true, surely they would have noticed. The old pain surged, sharp and sudden. This was how it had always worked. Silence mistaken for guilt, restraint for instability. My sister watched me carefully, confidence growing as I remained quiet. She pushed a little harder, suggesting consequences, urging the lawyer to act quickly to protect the family from further disruption. She believed she was winning. Then the lawyer raised a hand. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "there are additional materials we need to review." My sister frowned. "What materials?" He didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned to me and my fiancé, meeting our eyes with a look that said, "Now." My sister straightened in her chair, irritation flickering across her face. "This isn't necessary," she said. "I've already provided everything relevant." The lawyer nodded politely. "We'll determine that." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. I felt my heart pounding, but beneath it was something steadier. Certainty. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be undone. My sister leaned back, crossing her arms, a tight smile on her lips. She glanced at my parents as if to reassure them, as if this were just a brief inconvenience before order was restored. She had no idea how close she was to losing control. As the lawyer reached for his briefcase, I realized this was the last moment where her version of the story still existed, unchallenged. The last moment where silence could be mistaken for weakness. I didn't feel fear then. I felt ready. Whatever happened next would not be decided by who spoke the loudest or who looked the most convincing. It would be decided by what could no longer be denied. And for the first time in that room, I wasn't invisible anymore. The lawyer didn't raise his voice when he spoke. He didn't need to. "Before any conclusions are drawn," he said, looking around the table, "there are materials that must be reviewed by everyone present." My sister laughed softly, the sound edged with irritation. "I don't see why that's necessary. I've already submitted—" He held up a hand. "Ms. Holloway, please. You'll have a chance to respond." That was the first time her confidence wavered. My fiancé stood and walked to the screen mounted on the wall. He didn't look at my sister. He didn't look at my parents. He simply connected his phone and stepped aside. The video began without explanation. The room went silent. At first, it was just shaky footage of a hallway. Then my sister's voice filled the space, sharp and unmistakable. There was no mistaking the moment her hand grabbed my hair. No mistaking the sound of my body sliding across the floor. No mistaking her face as she leaned down and said, clearly and without hesitation, that I deserved nothing. I didn't watch myself in the video. I watched the people around me. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. She made a sound I had never heard before, something between a gasp and a sob. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the table as if it might swallow him whole. No one interrupted. No one spoke. When the video ended, the silence felt heavier than the sound ever had. My sister stood abruptly. "This is taken out of context," she snapped. "You didn't see what she did before that. She provoked me. She's been unstable for months." The lawyer didn't argue. He simply nodded and reached into his briefcase. "There is more," he said. He held up a small USB drive. "My grandmother's. This device was prepared by your grandmother prior to her death," he continued. "It contains a recorded statement made voluntarily and with clear intent." My sister's face drained of color. "That's not real," she said quickly. "She wasn't well. Anyone could have manipulated her. The video played. My grandmother's face appeared on the screen, calm and steady, just as it had been when I first saw it. She addressed me by name. She spoke about years of lies, about manipulation that thrived on silence. She admitted her fear, her regret, her decision to leave the truth behind in a form that couldn't be interrupted. "I am recording this," she said in the video, "because I know what will happen if Beatrice ever tries to speak for herself." My sister shook her head violently. "She turned her against me," she said, pointing at me. "She's always been jealous. She always wanted attention." The lawyer paused the video. "The recording has been authenticated," he said calmly. "Timestamps, metadata, and verification are all consistent. Additionally, the documents you submitted earlier contain discrepancies that warrant further review." My sister opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she looked uncertain, her eyes darting to my parents, searching for rescue. It didn't come. My mother's hands were trembling. My father finally looked up, his expression hollow and stunned. They didn't speak, but they didn't defend her either. The story they had accepted for years was collapsing in front of them, piece by piece, and there was nothing left to prop it up. I felt something loosen in my chest then. Not joy, not triumph, relief. For years I had rehearsed arguments in my head, imagined speeches that would finally make them understand. I hadn't needed any of them. The truth had spoken without me. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Given the content of these materials," he said, "there will be additional steps involving investigators and legal review. Ms. Holloway, I advise you to remain available for further questioning." My sister looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw it in her eyes. Not anger, not hatred, loss. She had lost the room. She had lost the story. She had lost the power she had held for so long simply by being believed. I stood up quietly. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. As I walked toward the door, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if a weight I hadn't known how to name had finally been set down. In the hallway, the noise of the meeting faded behind me. My fiancé joined me, his hand warm and steady in mine. I took one deep breath, then another. The fight was over. Whatever came next would be handled by lawyers and investigators, and consequences that had nothing to do with me anymore. I had already been given what I needed. The truth had been seen. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible at all. I didn't look back when I left the lawyer's office. The hallway felt brighter than it had when I arrived, as if the building itself had exhaled. My body was exhausted, every bruise making itself known now that the adrenaline was gone, but something inside me was finally quiet, not empty. Quiet in the way a room feels after a storm passes through and takes the worst of the damage with it. The consequences unfolded without me needing to witness them. Investigators followed up. Questions were asked. Documents were examined. My sister's carefully built image began to crack under the weight of what could no longer be denied. I didn't track the details. I didn't need to. Knowing it was happening was enough. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt about her downfall. I had imagined anger carrying me through it, imagined a sense of victory. Instead, there was only distance. The same distance I had been forced into for years, now chosen willingly. My parents reached out days later. Their messages were cautious, uncertain, stripped of the authority they once carried. When we finally spoke, their apologies came in fragments. They said they hadn't known, that they were confused, that they had trusted the wrong person. I listened without interrupting, letting them say what they needed to say without rushing to soothe them. When it was my turn, I spoke carefully. I told them I needed boundaries. That contact would happen on my terms, when I initiated it, and only if it stayed respectful. No defending what had been done. No rewriting the past to make it easier to live with. No asking me to forgive before I was ready. Boundaries, I explained, weren't punishment. They were protection. They didn't argue. For the first time, they didn't try to correct me. Whether that would last, I didn't know. But for once, the conditions were mine to set. I returned to my life slowly. Back to work, where I found a steadiness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Back to mornings that didn't start with dread, and nights that didn't end in rehearsed conversations I never planned to have. I leaned into the people who showed up without conditions, who didn't require me to shrink or explain my worth. In the quiet moments, I thought of my grandmother. I kept a few of her things, not the valuable pieces others might have fought over, but the objects that carried her presence. A worn scarf, a small framed photo. The USB drive she had trusted me with, now tucked away safely, its purpose fulfilled. Sometimes I replayed her words, not because I needed proof anymore, but because they reminded me of something simple and powerful. I had always been seen by someone. Her belief in me didn't erase what happened, but it reframed it. I wasn't the daughter who failed to earn love. I was the daughter who survived being denied it. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. In the way my shoulders relaxed when my phone buzzed, and it wasn't an accusation. In the way I stopped flinching at raised voices. In the way I no longer felt the urge to justify my existence to people who had already decided what I was worth. I learned that being quiet had never made me weak. It had kept me alive in a place that punished honesty. And now, I could choose when to speak and when to walk away. Some families choose comfort over truth. They cling to the version of events that asks the least of them, even when it costs someone else everything. If you've lived through that, if you've been dismissed or labeled or slowly erased until you began to believe it yourself, I want you to know something. Being treated as invisible does not mean you lacked value. It means someone else was afraid of what would happen if you were truly seen. If this story felt familiar, if it stirred something you've been carrying quietly for a long time, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your experiences in the comments. Sometimes sharing a piece of your story is the first step toward taking your power back. And if you want to stay with us for more stories about truth, boundaries, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, consider subscribing to the channel. We're here to tell stories where dignity survives betrayal and healing is just as important as justice. You never deserved to be erased. You were always worthy of being believed.